Game 10 of the World Chess Championship saw Magnus Carlsen take the white pieces against the challenger, Sergey Karjakin. In the standings, we know that Magnus Carlsen is trailing by a full point, by a single game, which makes games 10, 11, and 12, starting with the video you're about to watch, basically must-win situations. Every game we get into now, we know that Magnus Carlsen's title is on the line, and every game you get closer to ushering in a new world champion. Well, Game 10 happened on Thursday, November 24th, and this is what went down. E4, E5, and we had another Ruy Lopez. We had our second Berlin with Magnus Carlsen playing the white pieces, but rather than going in for the move 5-4 castles and then the variations with Rook E1, he played what is considered the most dynamic and flexible way to play for a win against a Berlin. Grandmaster Sasha Ipatov and I have been analyzing and suggesting that D3 was probably what Carlsen should have gone for in Game 3 earlier in the match, and he did so in Game 10. Now, the whole point of D3 is to be flexible, avoid all the forcing piece trades, and so after bishop to C5, it makes sense that yet another very flexible move would follow, and that's the move C3. What you get in these positions is an Italian structure, really. What you have is a position that looks like an Italian, a gioco piano, except the bishop is on B5 instead of C4. That'll be a little bit of a theme later on in this game. But what I want to highlight about the move C3 is that it's flexible, especially against the bishop to C5 development, because it threatens D4, which will come with tempo, and B4, which will come with tempo. That kind of dynamic opportunity to play on both sides of the board isn't something you get in every pawn structure. It's one of the reasons why bishop to c5 is almost always met with this move c3. And providing the context, the foundation of what's going on in these openings is something I've been doing in all of these videos, so we fully understand what the players are doing. After the move castles, we get bishop to g5. Now, like c3, bishop g5 is not the most popular move order. It's typical Magnus Carlsen to play very principled moves, very straightforward moves that make sense, but aren't necessarily the most well-known theoretically moves. So he continues on his theme, not changing that part of his game. Bishop to g5 actually reaches a position that he played as black against Alexei Shirov back in 2011. And in that position as black as well, he played the move h6, just like Sergey Karjakin did against him. And after bishop h4, he also played the move bishop to e7. This is a typical way to play this position as black, and I want to talk about this because I think it's something that will get beginners and amateurs, especially those of you who don't know the result of this game, and this is how you're finding out. Thank you for going to my channel to do that. Bishop to e7 does make a lot of sense. It is a breaking of the dogmatic rule, never move a piece twice in the opening before everybody is developed. But as we've talked about in a lot of these videos, and as I harp on for a lot of my students, development for development's sake is one thing, and leaving your pieces on the squares where they look the most pretty and active is it's not a bad thing, but it's also not always what the position needs overall. Your overall strategical approach to a position should dictate where the pieces go, right? You want to develop plans, not pieces. And so the plan for black is he's going to have to play d6, and he's going to have a pawn chain that faces the king side. And when that happens, you're going to want to play on that side of the board. Well, if you want to play on this side of the board, usually the natural thing would be to move this knight and to get some flow going, move the other f-pawn. You can't do any of those things as long as the knight is pinned to the queen. Playing a move like g5 to unpin the knight when you've already castled is virtual suicide, right? You'll never be able to take that back. And so bishop e7 is theory, and for those of you who are more advanced players, you're like, yeah, Danny, get on with it. We know bishop e7 is a good move. Excuse me while I stretch my back. But it's more, I'm trying to explain it for players who look at that move with some quizzical, like, how can that be, right? Well, the idea is to think about where your plan is headed overall and what the potential of your position is, not just are your pieces on active squares in the immediate sense. So bishop e7 is a move that unpins the knight, allows us to go for d6, and maybe to develop those plans as a good way to deal with this flexible Italian kind of structure. So that's why bishop e7 is played. There you go. Castles is played. Again, knight b to d2 is probably the slightly more common move order even in this line. So typical Carlsen, every move gets to a position that's been played but slightly less common. We're not going to talk too much about this little difference because knight b d2 was played on the next move, and we're just going to be transposing. We are still in theory, and even after knight h5, we are still following play that has happened before. But this is where we get our first official novelty, when Magnus Carlsen decides he's not going to play the move that was played. That was bishop to g3, and he's going to take on e7, not giving black the bishop pair. The reason for that is because bishop to g3, knight takes, h takes, in the game that it actually happened, Black kind of surprised white in that game. What white was playing for here was, well, I've given the bishop pair, but black can't really aggressively open the center too early because I'll take and double the pawns, and black will end up with a bunch of positional weaknesses before the center gets open. Well, black actually didn't agree with that, and in that game, black just played f5 rather than the move bishop to d7, which is even being recommended by the engine right now, but isn't even the best. f5 is the right dynamic way to play with the two bishops. And in that game, after the move bishop takes c6, white went for this positional idea, and d4. Black then took on e4, played the move d5 with tempo, forcing the knight back to d2, and then didn't close up the position, allowing knight e5, but opened it, because that's what you want to do when you have the bishops. And this position was better for black, regardless of what happened in that game that I'm referencing as a result. Black can play the move bishop to b7 and then support c5, which would open that bishop. Black can maybe even play c5 right away if you want to give back the bishop, but I think most likely bishop b7 is the plan if you're going for that. Even other moves that just defend the positional weakness, you're leading to a position where black has two bishops, the open f-file, and this game is going to become open. Black has a slight edge, as you can see, the computer agrees. So this is what would have happened if bishop g3 had been played, and regardless of how that game went, Carlsen probably either knows the game or just has a better feel for it and doesn't want to go for that position down the bishop pair, so he took on e7. After the move queen takes e7, we get the move knight to c4, a very common approach in these Italian games. Whenever you have two pawns that have met head-to-head in the center, by definition, if they both went two squares, they both left weaknesses adjacent to them. Remember this sort of pro tip here. The reason you remaneuver your pieces to go after those squares is because pawns can never go back, so those squares will always be weak. That's why you see every Ruy Lopez, the knight always goes from b1 to d2 to f1 and either into one of these squares and eventually tries to attack these light squares. That's exactly what white's doing here. And it's why you see black and a lot of Ruy Lopez's go forward with this kind of plan, also taking advantage of the fact that white has left the dark squares open. So this is good stuff to understand that these moves are not just random schemes being chosen out of a hat. They are the most principled. Knight e3 is played. After the move queen f6, we get our first kind of weird fighting move. What's going to happen to Carlsen here when we know he's on tilt? He played the move g3. g3 was a super aggressive move that risks opening the king and allowed knight h3 check. The point is that after king h1, unless Carlsen allows the f-file to become open and tactics on f2 to occur, the knight isn't very good here, right? You can't do anything right away. The knight is on the edge of the board. There isn't a way for black to immediately go after the light squares because bishop to g4 is just hanging. My knight's guarding that square. So yes, it's a risk it to get the biscuit kind of move, g3. But he's trying to create dynamic inequalities in the position. And so he risks the light squares and the king, but he puts the knight on edge. And maybe black doesn't have very good access to squares, again, as long as the f-file doesn't become open. Here, Karjakin played a great move, though. He played the move knight e7, which not only brings the knight around to prepare to try to prove Carlsen wrong on the king side, but also leaves this bishop empty. The bishop no longer has a purpose here, and we see it as exactly what I said earlier, a Ruy Lopez bishop in an Italian structure. So you know what Carlsen said? Well, he said, well, if you're going to fix your knight, I'm going to fix my Lopez bishop, and now I've made it an Italian bishop. It's on c4. After c6, I'm going to retreat because I don't want to deal with you doing the flexible attacks to my bishop that I described earlier. And after knight to g6, we get the move queen e2. A little precarious, this move, because there are tactics on f4. But the problem for Carlsen is he couldn't really move the queen anywhere else if you're talking about connecting the rooks to complete your development, because the knight would be hanging with check. So queen e2 was kind of forced in that sense. a5 is played really just a means to gain space. a4 was played pretty much instantly. And now we get bishop e6. This was the first critical moment of the game, and I remember it very clearly because I was keeping an eye on the game as I did Thanksgiving with my family. Happy Thanksgiving to all those in the United States watching this video, and some parts of Canada, I learned, also celebrate Thanksgiving. Who knew? But bishop e6 was played, and I'm telling my 8-year-old son as he's watching it on the app on my phone, and we're getting ready for Thanksgiving. I think I'm cutting the turkey or something, literally. And I'm like, okay, well, the move I suggest for Carlsen is either bishop to c2, maybe knight to d2, but the main thing you're not going to see Magnus Carlsen do is take on e6, and I explained to my son that bishop takes e6 would open up the f-file, and the f-file was the only way for black really to get aggressive chances against the king side, and the only way to really justify this knight on h3. So let me know when Carlsen plays bishop c2. I think that's the best move. I'm not just saying, I mean, look, okay, as we see Stockfish here, for those who don't like the engine version of my videos, just don't pay attention to it. For those who do, you love affirming everything I say, right? You love affirming what you know and not confirming. Just kidding. But okay, I think knight d2 is just as good as Stockfish says. I suggested this, but they're both fine. The move that can't be played is bishop takes e6, and so obviously you know what Magnus Carlsen did. He played bishop takes e6. And again, if you don't know the result of this game, just buckle up. We're about to get into some crazy stuff. The world went wild. What is wrong with Magnus Carlsen? Are we literally seeing another blunder? Hashtag, are you kidding me? Right, on Twitter. But no, Carlsen played bishop takes e6, and Karjakin took back with the f-pawn. And as we said, you can't deal with this knight by defending it with the king, because if you want to guess before Stockfish shows you, there's a knight trick coming to f4, and you're losing your queen. That's exactly the line I saw before I told my son you can't play bishop takes e6. I assumed that the knight couldn't move either because it takes f2. I learned when I got here, okay, maybe that's what Carlsen is planning, because that's exactly what he did, and he must have some tactics surrounding the fact that if black takes on f2, black is going to lose that piece. Well, sure enough, we got here, and Karjakin now is in a position to take on f2 and basically end the match. If he gets a draw here with black, he's one step closer. Okay, the match isn't over till it's over, but knight takes f2 surely must be played. If knight takes f2 and king to g1, the major point to note is that I have knight h3 check, where either you take the draw, and that should be all black needs, or you come up to g2, and eventually black gets this fork, as we highlighted. You're looking at a position where black has a rook, 2 pawns for the 2 knights, and a king to attack. Hashtag not interested. So that wouldn't have happened. But if the move king g2 is played, the problem is that after takes and king g2, black would have this move knight h4. So we were right that knight takes f2 could have been played. Now the king will have to go to g1, and this draw would have been forced. We would have seen Karjakin get exactly what he needed to get. Why can't the knight be taken? Because of the immediate queen to g6 check, and this king is actually either checkmated on the spot or has to block with the knight, and I don't even care how you take. I don't care. I mean, I think knight takes or queen takes is probably better for black here. This is just a nightmare. So what do, right? Obviously, if you're Sergey Karjakin, you take the pawn. Well, guess what? He didn't. He played d5. The world goes wild again. We're setting the Twitter sphere on fire, and suddenly I'm being pulled away from Thanksgiving. Like, what is going on in this game? d5 is played. Now, d5 is not a bad move. It expands in the center. It puts some pressure, and yes, it is a potentially weakening move to these doubled e-pawns, right? You doubled the e-pawns in order to get the f-file, which was a good thing. Now, you have to be very careful when you play d5, because if this pawn ever pushes or ever takes on e4, look for these e-pawns to become a huge weakness. They're now going to become backward and doubled. But d5 is probably still okay, though surely with d5, Karjakin expects Carlsen to play some move like f3 or something. Fool me once, shame on you, but I'm not going to let you have a second chance to play knight takes f2 check, right? Wrong. I'll take queen h5 for 600, Alex. Another blunder. What is going on here? Magnus Carlsen plays queen h5, and Trebek, you know what? It's time for you to take on f2, right? Surely Karjakin is not going to miss it a second time, though he did. You can already tell by the tone I'm taking. And what's interesting is, okay, psychologically, maybe you can actually forgive Sergey more than Magnus. Magnus is on, okay, you can forgive Magnus from the perspective that he's on tilt. He has to create something. Still blundering and allowing these chances to occur is ill-advised, right? I mean, you don't want to lose, then the match is really over. But if you're Sergey, psychologically, I guess the fact that you didn't go for it the move before makes you less likely to go for it now. Is that part of the psychology? I don't know. I mean, certainly knight takes f2, he was not thinking white would take, because now black can just take on f2. And just because the queen came to h5 doesn't change the fact that one of your ponies is hanging and black is going to win in some variation there. You're going down the exchange if you're white. So queen h5 doesn't stop knight takes f2 because the knight is hanging. That's point number 1. Number 2, knight takes f2 is still possible after queen h5, because after knight takes f2, even after queen h5, once again, king to g1 or king g2 are both met solidly by tactics. King to g1 is met immediately by the trick that occurs in this line several times, moves like queen to g5. These moves force white to capture on g5, and the key is you have an intermezzo, knight h3 check, and the knight gets out just like a thief in the night, scot-free. He took the f2 pawn, and he gets out to tell the tale to all of his buddies. So if king g1 can't be played because of queen to g5, why not king g2? Well, the problem with queen g2 is that after queen f7, probably white's best chance is just to go back to g1 and play a little tickle here and take a draw. Why? Well, the point is, queen f7 threatens something with the king on g2. Knight f4 check, which is a discovered attack on the queen. The only other way to deal with that kind of threat is is, okay, queen e2 we already know is a bad idea due to knight h4 check, followed by queen to g6. Or, of course, you have to move the king and take the perpetual. If you just sit on the position, we have knight here check. So there's not really any way to deal with this position other than either king to g1 or queen f6. So if we go back to this position, would there have been anything else that Carlsen could have possibly have planned? The only thing we could come up with, after analyzing this position for a very long time and preparing for this video so that all of my viewers get the most accurate information possible, is probably the move h4 here. Again, any other move is failing to this queen g5 trick, followed by knight h3 check coming. That's assuming black has nothing else. h4 is the only move that prevents this queen g5 trick, but now here come the tactics. Knight f4. This is going to get sassy. G takes f4 is met by queen takes f4. And there's a number of lines here. You can check it out with your computer on your own time if you don't believe me, but let's just say black is going to be the one winning here. So one line we analyzed was queen e2 with queen g3 check, and after knight g2, knight g4 threatening mate. Yes, this position is not one where white resigns immediately, but I challenge you to find a useful move here for white. White is frozen, right? Hashtag let it go, let it go. The king side's completely locked down. I shouldn't sing Frozen songs, but I just did. Okay, so anyway, it's over. Frozen on the king side, you got to let it go. Magnus would have lost this, which means he probably would have had to let go his chances of winning this game after this whole little tickle idea, because he probably just needed to just repeat with the kings. This was going to be his best chance, knowing what we now know about h4. H4 in this position. So what happened when all of this makes sense as well? Surely we're now back to a scenario where obviously the second time we're going to take on f2? Nope. Karjakin played knight to g5, and yes, it was bad because of everything we just calculated, and I know I spent a lot of time on the tactics there, but that's because it really may end up proving to be one of the most critical, pivotal moments in this match. The lack of proper execution by Karjakin in given this opportunity. And that's not attempting to try to foreshadow the result of this game in any way, but this is a big moment here, and Karjakin has a chance to grab the bull by the horns, and unfortunately, he didn't, or Magnus called his bluff. He wasn't ready, however you want to make of it. Carlsen doesn't miss his next chance. He plays h4, which forces the knight into f3, which is going to force us into the endgame. All of these moves are forced. And suddenly, is this a position that we immediately evaluate as just, winning for white? No, by no means. Even though white is slightly better here, this is not just winning for white, but it is Magnus Carlsen-esque, right? I mean, it's exactly the kind of position he's best known for. As I've said about Magnus Carlsen before, his chess style is that of a spoiled brat. And I don't mean that I'm calling him a spoiled brat. I mean, Carlsen gets to be a spoiled brat because he's the best in the world at squeezing the water out of the stone. He wants to have his cake and eat it too. Magnus Carlsen wants positions where he's the only one who can win, and if he happens to screw up, okay, it's a draw. That's where he's most comfortable. He wants this kind of very intricate, very, very, very small advantage for white that's based pretty much solely on the positional dysfunction of the e-pawns. That's what Magnus wants. So again, it's not that Karjakin is just losing the match with not taking f2, but he is giving Carlsen exactly what he wants in this type of game. Is the Russian going to defend like a rock for the remainder of this video? You're going to find out. Or is Carlsen going to get his mojo back? I'll say this. I would not want to go for a position like this against Carlsen, who, as I said, he wants to play spoiled chess. He wants to have his cake and eat it too, and that's what he wants. And if you give it to him, he does it better than anybody. Rook e1 is played here, and this is a very good move by Carlsen. Rook e1 is played at the risk of looking like a fool to lose a tempo. If the move rook a to f8 would have been played here, which was analyzed a lot, it seems that at first glance, white would be forced to go back to f1. And as you can see, the engine agrees that at first glance, white should just submit to losing a tempo, which for the record is not the end of the world for white, because a tempo or not, a tempo in an endgame, this isn't losing a tempo in the opening where the center becomes open and your king gets checkmated. A tempo in an endgame where you're positionally better, the evaluation still says white is slightly better, and I still agree with it. So a tempo wouldn't have been the worst thing, but even more than that, the key after rook a to f8, after takes f3, king g2, rook f7, rook a to f8, is that probably he wouldn't have even lost the tempo. He probably would have gone for rook e2, despite the immediate risk, the immediate horizon effect by the computer that says, hey, I can take e4 because I have tacticos. Check this out. If you take back, Chekalina la Shlamba, that's a fork town, and after takes, you take with the pawn, and either you give me the knight and we have an equal rook ending, or you let me get f3 check and I win the rook. So this was a trick that Karjakin may have had up his sleeve. But there's something here that doesn't meet the eye at first. White can actually sacrifice the pawn with knight to c4 and give up a second pawn. Suddenly, you start letting the computer think here, as I did with Komodo, the most recent Komodo 10, for a while, because I wanted to be sure. And then even as you let Stockfish think here, suddenly you start to realize something really strange after knight to c4. And by the way, after knight to c4, there's not really any better options than to just take this pawn, right? Anything else, you're going to, White's threatening to win back the pawns anyway, so you might as well just go ahead and take on d3. And the problem here for Black is that actually, despite being up 2 pawns, everybody's hanging. And this wouldn't have been very easy. And I'm convinced that Carlsen did exactly what he does best and created an opportunity for his opponent to brilliantly go wrong and give him weird winning chances. I mean, let's analyze moves like the rook defends the d-pawn. We're going to bring the other rook to e1. A5 is going to fall, E5 might fall, D3 is falling, and the more time you give the engines to evaluate the position, the more you realize how much better White must be positionally to be down 2 pawns and actually be slightly better here. So this was a very, very interesting little trick that Carlsen potentially laid for his opponent. Karjakin didn't take the bait, but it already shows you this was heading toward a Magnus Carlsen game, because what was the point of rook e1? Not just to go for that trap, but the last thing you want in an endgame like this is for a rook to be stuck guarding a pawn where it serves no other purpose. Remember that tip. You want your rook guarding a pawn where it also attacks your opponent's weaknesses, where it also defends your b2 pawn. That's where you want your rook, serving multiple purposes. You don't want your rook stuck here. So Carlsen, yes, it's a little bit risky if he was forced to do that, but not the end of the world. Worst case scenario, he miscalculated. But actually, even on this very nice trick, it shows you, again, I'm going for the wrong rook a to f8 in this position, that actually somehow, some way, this position is turning out to be better for White. You tip your hat to Magnus Carlsen when those kind of things happen, because very, very interesting stuff. Karjakin didn't go for rook a f8. He played h5, but the problem is now knight f1 is played, which was the whole idea behind this move, not just to make sure the rook wasn't passive, but to free that square for the knight. You give White a couple of the moves, the knight comes to d2, to f3, into g5 or e5, and Bob might be your uncle there in a bad, awkward kind of family relationship way. After king f8, though, it really became clear that Karjakin was not settled with the position. He thought for a long time on this move, and it's a concession in the sense that he clearly doesn't believe he can hold the position if it remains as it is. So he has to commit to this journey of the king coming to the other side of the board. Again, we already know rook f8 is not going to work at all anymore, because the rook will come to e2, and Black will be seen having lost the tempo as White continues his plan. So though it's hard for me to find a much better move for Black, I think king f8 is telling that Karjakin felt like he was going to be pushed. Here comes knight to d2, the king comes to e7, and then rook e2, which is preparing the move knight f3, making sure that f2 is protected, all of those good things. The king comes into d6, and okay, in the endgame, it is typically advised to bring the king out into the center, but in this situation, because the king might get in trouble, that's where the double-edgedness comes in. Carlsen goes forward with the plan. Knight f3, and the knight makes it to the square. We highlighted it would as soon as the journey on f1 started. And over the next several moves, what you're going to see is Carlsen really just sort of flexing the muscles, building up on the e-pawn, not because he expects Karjakin to really crack in terms of that weakness, but maybe the overwhelming pressure here forces Black to create other concessions. Hashtag principle of two weaknesses, a very common plan in endgames where you have the slight edge. Push and push and push, and at some point another part of the board becomes weak because your opponent is overly committed to defending the area they're already in. And that's why you have to be patient and let these endgame advantages sort of build on themselves. Now the knight comes back to f3. Still, we're looking for some fun. The knight goes to g8. Amazingly, there aren't just some immediately winning tactics with takes and check or some crazy stuff, but there wasn't. Karjakin was ready. Carlsen did say, well, I am going to take advantage of your knight leaving, though, by opening the center somewhat. Yes, I'm letting you undouble your pawns, but with it comes a little intermezzo, because you can't play e5 due to the fact that I have knight f5 check, which means I'm going to be able to build up with this intermezzo check and get something new. I've given up the double e-pawns, but I'm allowing my advantage to evolve. Strong players don't stay stuck on the way to win the game. They stay stuck on winning the game. They allow the advantage to evolve. If a kingside attack becomes a pawn-up endgame, or if up the exchange becomes an easily winning knight endgame, you let it happen, right? And so you don't miss your opportunities to just improve your position. the advantage is staying within the realm, even the computer agrees, of just about slightly better to almost clearly better for white. But it's the squeeze that matters here. It's the squeeze that makes Magnus Carlsen so tough to deal with. Here comes the rook into f6. Rook has to go to g7, and I'm just going to play the next few moves because you just see Carlsen working it. He's working both sides of the board. He's shaking what his mama gave him, and here comes the knight into the next square. Now the knight is hitting both b7 and e6, making black have more problems with defending and keeping the pieces on awkward squares. The next several moves are a lot of tickle. In fact, almost a little too much tickle for my liking, and I enjoys me a good tickle. But this is just a lot of just kind of back and forth stuff. What's going to happen in the end is very simple. Will black be able to get enough counterplay to deal with b5? At some point, b5 is going to come in. The b7 pawn is going to be the second weakness that we foreshadowed, combined with the e6 pawn. Will black be able to either unhinge the knight the moment it loses its protection or use the d pawn for counterplay? We're going to find out. Unfortunately, though, as moves just continue to get settled, the more you get convinced, like, something's not going well here for the challenger, and here comes the strike. b5, chopalicious chop down, and I think at this point, the question is, what is the immediate threat? I don't even know if I know the immediate threat, but I know rook b6 is coming. Then the rook will really not be able to leave, and how you deal with e6. Because of the inevitable, Karjakin decides to start making it aggressive right now. Will the d-pawn be able to get enough counterplay to justify b5? That was a question I asked. Here comes rook to b6. The e6 pawn is falling, and unfortunately, the answer is going to be no. For the first time in this match, we actually see the world champion get a massive advantage in a squeezable way from something that started many moves ago. Rook to c3 is played. After the rook is defended by the knight, now we get this sort of weird approach. A lot of time was spent here by Carlsen. He probably could have just taken on g6. That is what the engine suggests, but you get these like crazy lines with rook takes g6, rook takes d3, knight takes d3, and then black tries to get his pass pawn going. That was just a mouse slip by me. And I think Carlsen was trying to calculate the clear win in these lines and didn't like the idea he would have to move his knight. Am I going to be able to deal with the d pawn? The f pawn's falling. Something about this position didn't sit well with Carlsen, and if I had to guess, he might have missed the intermezzo rook f6. One of the key points here is that after takes and takes, white just has too many pawns in this rook ending. This isn't going to be an all rook endings or drawn kind of thing. This is going to be just way too many pawns. You can bring the king back, and eventually I'll sacrifice my e pawn. You can even take it now, and I'll get your d pawn. And at some point, black is not going to be able to defend this position. Something like this will occur. And the pawn will fall. This pawn's hanging. Too many pawns for white. So likely Carlsen missed rook f6, but I'm not really in the business of predicting what the strongest player in history might have missed because it seems like a bad business to go into. But he didn't go for rook takes g6. Instead, he went for the much more human approach, which involved a mating net. He played this interesting move, knight to d5. Sort of strange. At first, it seemed like it gave up some advantage, but the key point is the knight is coming to b5 with check, and once the king goes to the 8th rank, now when you take g6, you have mating net ideas. So, for example, if rook takes f3, knight to b5 check, the king moves, and you take over here, and there's all kinds of checkmate threats coming. In fact, there's also this move a6, which is also pretty much just winning on the spot. So this is not something that black could have allowed, and because of that, after rook takes d3 and knight takes d7, Karjakin played the only move king b8, and after knight to b5, played the only move king to c8. Karjakin does find only moves when it matters. It's one of the things he does best. And the advantage is still sitting just around 1.5 points, but it was enough for Carlsen. He took on g6, and after rook takes f3, he made the accurate, albeit a little bit, again, like very human approach to the position. It's not the engine's approach to win this game. He wanted to just simplify with knight to d6 check. And after the move, I'm sorry, I left the line here. 1 second, that's right. After the move, knight to b5, king c8, rook takes. Sorry, he played king g2 first with tempo, yes. Gaining a tempo on the rook, which just makes sense to get out of any tricks on the 3rd rank. Then we traded into the rook ending. Again, a very human approach for the world champion to take. In fact, look at the position after king g2. Or sorry, it doesn't like king to g2, and it doesn't really even like the idea of the rook ending, but it is a win for white, regardless of whether the computer thinks it was best. And then the move rook to e3 was played. we're going to get a rook ending that isn't as fancy as the last one I showed, where white had 3 pawns he was holding, but it's going to be enough, because the worst thing about a rook ending is not even always being down pawns. It's whether your king and rook can be as active as the enemy king and rook. And often, as the Dvoretzky School of Chess would say, you would rather choose an active rook and be down this pawn than you would have a rook that is totally passive to defending it. The problem in this case is black can't even afford that approach, because 2 connected passers, right, not defending this pawn is hardly an option here either. So after rook h6, the king began to come in. Karjakin tries a last-ditch stand to bring the king around to a7, but simply resigns after the king reaches f6. The threat is king to g7. The rook will be forced to leave the h-file, and white will get his desired 2-pass pawns. Even a move like rook to g8 is just met by rook g5, just stopping everything, because the king and pawn ending is easily lost, and something like this will probably cause black to resign very soon anyway. So that's it. So no more, we're not going into spoiler alerts anymore. You now know the result. Magnus Carlsen won Game 10 of the World Chess Championship, and the score is now knotted up at 5. Ladies and gentlemen, are you not entertained, right? This is turning out to be an insanely exciting World Chess Championship match. Magnus Carlsen did what he had to do. He won. Are we going to get more decisive results in games 11 and 12, or will we see a rapid playoff? Who knows? I'm signed up for either one, right? You know that our coverage of the next game will be on Saturday, November 26th. That's game 11 at 5 p.m. Pacific over at chess.com TV if you want to see what not only I have to say, but all the other guest experts who help us analyze these games. We are putting so many resources. We have 3 members on site, 3 team members on site, so many guests joining us. They all help with the analysis so we can have so much the most accurate review possible for all of you. I appreciate everybody following this series. Hopefully you enjoyed this educational breakdown. Hopefully you learned something. I don't know. And I'll see you guys after the well-deserved break day, TGIF. That's what tomorrow is. Saturday is when the next game is, and we will have a show for you come rain or shine, regardless.